We definitely see ourselves as enabling foundation for all these products and services that, again, make it easier to use the blockchain. And the last thing I'll say is our vision here is if in 2017 you tried to build some sort of product in the space, we would liken that to using maybe a hammer and a chisel, and maybe you could build a hut basically. But with the tools and services that we provide, we're hoping to help people build skyscrapers with really powerful tools that make new things possible.
Hey there, good people in crypto land. I'm Matt Leising, and this is my podcast, Decent People. Welcome back to the conversation. On the show today, I've got Jason Shah, who is head of growth at Alchemy. Alchemy, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is an infrastructure provider that's in the background with a lot of Web3 projects, but they have helped basically almost the entire Web3 ecosystem evolve and be built behind the scenes. They help power most of the NFT market by being the back end for firms like OpenSea, and they're really big in just a lot of essential building blocks for developers to use so that you don't have to write all the code yourself. Jason is the head of growth there, and it feels like I've been writing about Alchemy for a long time. I got to know the co-founders, Joe and Nikhil, back when I was at Bloomberg News, and they were raising money every couple of months, it seemed like, and they quickly tripled their valuation to more than $10 billion as of early 2022. Whether that's still the case with the crypto bear market, I'm not sure, but the bottom line is they are growing like a weed. So we talked about Jason's past career at Amazon and Airbnb and how some of the differences between those Web 2 centralized companies and what he's doing now in Web 3, where the goal is always to be decentralized. We talked about music being broken and how peer-to-peer and on-chain music is a real bright light for a lot of artists right now to remake their careers. And we talked about some of his past work and getting into sort of fintech and the web with a project he created back in the day called ineedapencil.com. So that was a fun little sidetrack there. But with all that being said, let's get to the conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Hey, Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Matt. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I am too. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Where am I talking to you from today?
Today I'm in San Francisco.
Is that home base for you usually?
That is home base, and I'm in the lovely, very full and energetic Alchemy office here in SF. So yeah, I'm usually here, and today's yet another energetic and fun day here in the office.
Yeah, cool. So let's jump into Alchemy and tell folks what you guys are doing there, because it's really interesting. Alchemy is like in the background of a lot of Web3 applications. Like they help power NFT marketplaces like OpenSea and others, and they're just a really big sort of infrastructure provider for all of the decentralized apps out there that folks are using. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit more, Jason, from your point of view of what Alchemy is doing and its role in the whole ecosystem and where you guys are headed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. So Alchemy was started in 2017 by our co-founders, Joe and Nikhil, and they really wanted to help people build blockchain products. We all believe in kind of a more decentralized internet, but they discovered this problem in the early days where it was just simply too difficult to build. People would have node issues, the APIs were too complicated, and it wasn't really simple enough as a developer to just get started with one line of code and start building your product and focusing on that. So that's where the company got started. And now, over the last 5, 6 years, Alchemy has grown to, as you noted, help support wonderful and important products and companies like OpenSea, Web2 companies like Stripe and DraftKings, and a lot of the new crypto startups that are being formed just today, because we help not only the large companies and growing crypto startups, but also just individual developers that are looking to get started easily. As a result, we power a lot of the largest NFT marketplaces, DeFi protocols, as well as analytics providers, games, decentralized social media providers, and so on. And so we really see ourselves as playing that role of connecting builders with blockchains and helping them build products. We do that across the Ethereum network, layer twos like Optimism, Arbitrum, Polygon, as well as other networks like Solana. So the company today is powering thousands and thousands of products, and we're really excited about the future of Web3 and helping there be more products that flourish in the coming years.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then in simple terms, can you just explain what is it that you guys are providing? Is it like It's software solutions or like what code or like what is it that folks come to you to get out of the box, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So out of the box, we provide APIs, which for those that don't know are application programming interfaces. And what that allows for an individual to do is to very easily read and write data to the blockchain. For example, if you're OpenSea and if you want to either show an NFT to a user or you want to complete a transaction on their behalf, we help you do that. If you're a wallet like Phantom and you want to use Alchemy to simulate what's going to happen on a transaction and then help a user, say, send funds to a smart contract, we help you do that. So, really, our role is playing this supporting entity between a blockchain and a developer to make it super easy to build products.
Yeah. And it's always interested me. I covered exchanges for Bloomberg News for a long time. And if you can create a successful exchange, you're part of the infrastructure of the market and you're indispensable. And it's a great business in most cases because people are coming to you to trade. And it feels like Alchemy, you guys, Joe and Nikhil, hit on that same sort of idea. Like one of your investors said to me once, it's picks and shovels that you guys are providing to the Web3 world. And he wanted to invest in the company that was providing picks and shovels, like to gold miners in the gold rush era. Is that how you see it? And how's that going?
We definitely see ourselves as a foundational part of the ecosystem and started from first principles of how could we create value and help pursue this mission of bringing blockchain to a billion people. And the largest and most important problem was that it was just simply too difficult to actually read and write data from the chain. Over time, we've added more and more products and services that have helped towards that mission of, again, bringing a billion people into blockchain by making it easier for developers to build. I would say there's a couple of other aspects to call out here. One is the product lifecycle in new internet paradigms. And so we believe in this model of developers build products, bring in users. The more users that enter the space, the more incentivized developers are to join, and the cycle continues. And so if you believe in Web3 and blockchain, then one of the best things that you can do, which Alchemy has done for the last several years, is to really help provide a developer platform. And we've seen this historically as well. We saw this in the preceding two eras of computing with the personal computer and platforms like Microsoft and Apple. And then with the modern internet, like a platform like Amazon Web Services that makes it possible to have products like Airbnb and Uber. And so in Alchemy's case, we're providing that layer on top of Ethereum, Polygon, Arbitrum, Optimism, Solana, and other chains in order to make it possible to have an NFT collection like CryptoPunks, which was actually one of the first users of Alchemy in the early days. Same thing with OpenSea, same thing with Phantom, same thing with Shopify that's doing token gating for their merchants and products as well. So we definitely see ourselves as enabling foundation for all these products and services that again make it easier to use the blockchain. And the last thing I'll say is our vision here is if in 2017 you tried to build some sort of product in the space, we would liken that to using maybe a hammer and a chisel, and maybe you could build a hut basically. But with the tools and services that we provide, we're hoping to help people build skyscrapers with really powerful tools that make new things possible.
That's great. I the foundation story of the company because the founders, Joe and Nikhil, they were both TAs, I think, for a class at Stanford, and they were teaching together. And I think they got the inspiration for Alchemy while there. And they're just really nice guys. And I'm just curious, I would imagine they set a pretty good tone for the rest of the company in their leadership style.
Yeah, absolutely. Founders are so important to the culture and the mission and just the everyday operating of any business. And Joe and Nikhil are no different in that sense and have had kind of a irreplaceable, obviously, impact, not only from founding the company itself, but to this day. And you're absolutely right. They met at Stanford. They worked together for years on actually dozens of products, toiling away as startup founders, really just trying to create something of meaningful value that changes the world in a positive way and positively impacts life for everybody on the planet. That's actually how big they dream was the scope of what they've wanted to do. And now with Alchemy and really playing this role in Web3, that's coming to fruition. Joe and Nikhil are incredible founders who, like you said, met at Stanford many years ago. I want to say it's probably been a decade at this point, I think longer, that they've known each other. And to this day, their values, their vision, their product strategy has a really important impact on the direction of the company and has helped the company get to where it is today.
Yeah, I got to know them when I was at Bloomberg because they kept raising money. And so it's like every 3 months it seemed, oh, Alchemy's raising another round and now they're worth, I don't know, 500 million. And then it was a billion. And then it was like, I don't, where are you guys at now?
In the last valuation of the company, Alchemy became a $10 billion company, but really what it's always been about is, again, this core mission, and the capital that's been raised has enabled us to invest in hiring the best team possible, building the most valuable products, reinvesting in the ecosystem. For example, we have a $25 million grant program called WAGB to help builders use Alchemy and grow their projects. We've also started a venture fund, Alchemy Ventures, that's probably invested in more than 50 companies at this point, probably north of $50 million deployed, a lot of value created for founders. And so I think Joe and Nikhil have done an excellent job of kind of intelligently taking capital and translating that to create value in the world, which I think is what you kind of hope for with any founder in any company ultimately.
Yeah, for sure. And I was looking it up today, some of the old stories I wrote about you guys, and it popped out to me that you got some interesting investors. Obviously, there's the usual suspects like VC firms and whatnot, but one investor is the Glazer family, which owns Manchester United, the soccer club, and the other is the rock band, the Chainsmokers. Do you know any of the background there of how those guys came in to be some of your investors?
That's a great question. I think in general, Joe Nikhil's philosophy has been how can we partner with the most effective set of investors? And some of those will be financial investors, some of them are technology investors who can help recruit and advise on how to grow the company in the best way possible. And then others are folks that are just highly influential in the broader kind of culture and world, because ultimately blockchain and Web3 can otherwise be very esoteric concepts and really hinges on an ability for crypto and Web3 to go mainstream. And I think ultimately that's what's been underpinning the types of investors that Alchemy has brought into the Alchemy family, as we call it, and really helped us over the years in terms of mainstreaming a new technology that otherwise can be hard to understand, but really important if enough people can adopt it and we can make three as large of an ecosystem as we're hoping it will become.
Yeah. Have the chain smokers been red pilled? Are they're hip to the Web3 world?
What I can't speak on their behalf, but what I can say is that fortunately, all the investors that are on that roster that Alchemy has built over the years are deep believers in, first and foremost, Joe and Nikhil's people and the team that we've built. We're about 120 people now who are all very passionate about Web3 and work extremely hard. And then believers, yes, in the kind of vision of we've built up the internet into this really important force in society, but wondering and exploring how can we shift it in new ways that decentralizes data, decentralizes ownership, has aspects of more composability and open source software. And I think that's what's really drawn folks in over time, is a real belief that is actually a better version of the internet than what we have today. And that's worth backing founders like Joe and Nikhil to go out and do.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll get to that, but I'd like to kind of take a step back and just ask, as a kid, did you think this is where you were headed, or what were you doing as a kid, and where did you grow up, and what was that like for you?
I don't know if I totally foresaw 2023 working on Web3 at Alchemy when I was a kid. I grew up in New Jersey in the late 80s and 90s. My parents are both immigrants from India and came here in the 70s. And I was the youngest of three, always precocious, tinkering with things. Was very interested in more creative pursuits in terms of art and writing. And I was a loner as a youngest child, also, who was left to my own devices for a lot of my childhood. I've always had an interest in technology, though. I started my first company in 2005 when I was still in school. And I was kind of inspired by a story where my sister was a teacher and several of her students were struggling with getting into college and things that I was having an easier time because I had a better support system. And so all of a sudden I could use the internet to build a whole set of content, tools, put it online, make it completely free. And that was feasible for the first time, right, in the 2000s. So once I did that, I've never stopped since. And I've always been trying to use technology to try to solve important problems. And that's what ultimately attracted me to Alchemy. So even though I didn't foresee it, I think in the last few years, it became obvious to me that as the internet continues to have more and more of an importance in society, obviously we saw this with, let's say, the iPhone in 2007, with social networks growing through the early 2010s, large platforms emerging. There's no company on the earth today that doesn't need the internet in some form. or any society really that could potentially benefit from it. So ultimately, what drew me here was this kind of arc of always trying to use technology to try to solve important problems, which I think Web3 has the opportunity to do.
Okay. Was that company you just mentioned, I need a pencil.com?
Yeah, that was my first company back
Okay,
in '05.
cool. And it was helping, it was like educational resources for kids that were trying to get into college.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so today, were your parents into tech and are you able to explain like what you do at Alchemy to them? Do they get it? Or is it like something that you have to explain like a million times like I do to my parents still?
I'm probably more similar to you in that sense. My mom was a chemist and my dad is a physician. And so their view was always do what you're passionate about, go for your goals, is a favorite phrase that my mom had. And they didn't push in any one direction, but they're also not tech people by their own background. So I think it's at Alchemy, we joke, we have the t-shirts that say, my mom thinks I work at Bitcoin. And so I think that's what our dinner conversations are when I'm home for Thanksgiving, for Christmas. So I think, perhaps our parents' generation they see a lot of these technology changes happen. The pace is so fast, it's so hard to keep up with. But there's a general understanding of these tools are hopefully making us more productive, hopefully more connected. Obviously, these are things any tool is capable of both positive and negative things, but I think in general there's a sense of this is hopefully moving us in the right direction as a society.
Yeah. I bought my mom $100 in Bitcoin back in 2017, I think. And so she dutifully checks it every day and definitely gives us something to talk about. But that's about the
Right.
extent of it. Earlier in your career, though, you were at some of the big Web2 companies like Amazon and Airbnb. And I'm curious, what was your experience there? And because a lot of Web3 is trying to provide an alternative to centralized companies like Airbnb or Amazon, that Amazon does everything. Airbnb is a better maybe of what people were reacting to when there's a middleman that's just sitting there and taking a fee like 30% or whatever it is in transactions that in a peer-to-peer decentralized network kind of goes away. Did, coming out of that, how did you feel, and was that something that kind of drew you to the Web3 world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had very positive experiences when I was both at Amazon and Airbnb in terms of working on products that I felt solved problems for people. At Amazon, I largely focused on AWS, so it was analogous to some of the work here at Alchemy in terms of it should be really easy to spin up a S3 bucket and be able to store media. It should be really easy to deploy an EC2 instance and scale your web application. And I think a company like Amazon and a platform like AWS has, in fact, even though it is a centralized company, had that impact of making it super easy for an individual to, let's say, just quickly build a product and deploy it and do so at a low cost, generally speaking. But again, it's not without some trade offs and downsides. And when I was at Airbnb, it was great. People wouldn't have stayed in other people's homes if there wasn't, in the early days, a centralized platform that verified who they were, provided trust. There was a way to remediate a situation if there was some sort of safety incident or some sort of conflict. But again, for example, when we were going public, we made an effort to provide hosts with equity in Airbnb. But to your point, I started wondering, I was like, wouldn't it have been great if instead, if I was the fifth host at Airbnb, that I was able to share in the same economic upside as an early employee? And same thing with AWS. It's like, yes, I want to be able to build my products quickly, but if I want to be able to quickly move my data around, or if I am in a situation where I need to kind of change locations, then I can easily kind of transfer data across countries portably and have that ownership. And so for me, it's been part of this overall arc where in the earlier days of the internet, we just had certain problems that needed to be solved to be able to have any internet products exist in the first place. I remember when MySpace used to melt down every other day before Facebook was around, and just building infrastructure and having servers was more of a kind of fundamental problem than being able to even think about what it would be like for shared ownership of the protocol or data portability or things like that. But then, as we've seen in the last 10 years, there are a lot of challenges and downsides with what happens over time as technology and power and data can concentrate. And so for me, it's kind of been an arc where I'm like, okay, great. I've worked on these internet products. I'm proud kind of what those were able to do, but things could be better. And how could they be better? Alchemy is a big part of that now in terms of starting to really push this platform that can shift the norm for how we build internet products to something that is more decentralized, where governance happens through a DAO, where the upside of the protocol or the products doing well is economically rewarding for those that participated. Those past experiences definitely shaped me ending up at Alchemy and thinking, what's the next step? How do we push the internet to a better state? But I think that they were necessary things since before Ethereum, it didn't really, I don't think there was necessarily a viable option for as decentralized of an internet as we're starting to build towards now today.
Yeah, I agree with you. And something you mentioned caught my ear. You were saying that Amazon and Airbnb make it super easy for people to use their services or to do things on the internet. That still seems to be a huge hurdle in Web3, that it's not even close to super easy. And I know you guys are building products to help developers make it easier, but where do you think we are on that scale in terms of getting it to being a lot easier and maybe not as sometimes as stressful as like sending transactions that you might be screwing up? Is it getting better, or how would you put that into context?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's getting better, but it can be hard to see sometimes. I think it's hard to see it for those of us that are in the industry because we're working on these problems day to day. We are aware of all the challenges very viscerally because we know a friend who maybe lost their seed phrase, or we're trying out products that don't yet, let's say, take advantage of something like account abstraction to create a really beautiful and simple user experience. And so we see those friction points and the challenges there. I think that it breaks down into, I think roughly speaking, there's kind of education, security, and user experience that are really key here. And I think that number one, do people even understand the benefits of a blockchain based product? Do they understand how it works? I think that in the last kind of couple of years, we made a lot of progress with that, but I think we're still quite a ways off from the mainstream individual kind of understanding that. I think we're starting to make progress in terms of, let's say, emerging markets where people can hold crypto, send crypto more easily, avoid some, let's say, government confiscation in certain cases. Like, I think that there's progress being made, but it's still, I think, something that needs to actively be worked on by the industry. I think in terms of security, same thing. I think it's everything from smart contract auditing being more available, best practices being well understood and deployed. I think users understanding how to stay safe and the value of using wallet, let's say transaction simulation in wallets or other features that make it easier to benefit from self custody rather than have it kind of end up being a net negative if, let's say, you lose funds. So I think we're making a lot of progress on the security front, but it still takes some work. And then user experience. Like, I think that there's been a lot of experimentation in terms of products to build in the space, everything from promising social media products like Lens and Farcaster to platforms like Uniswap to DeFi protocols like Goldfinch for borrowing and lending in emerging markets. There's a lot of things that are being experimented with, but I think that the user experience is still something that we're collectively working on as an industry to make even easier than, let's say, what people are used to in Web 2. I think all these things need to still happen to push adoption forward.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I was just talking the other day to somebody at Wallet Guard, one of the co-founders, and they're doing some really cool stuff where, like you mentioned, they'll have transaction simulations, so you'll get to see what you're doing before you sign anything. And so, or they have this thing where it's a browser extension and they'll be scanning websites to see if there's any kind of wallet draining malware on that website for when you want to go connect your. I was really happy to hear about that, and I was just wondering, like, why is it taking so long? It seems like these things definitely have been needed for a while, but it's good to see that there is progress being made. Along those lines, like you guys are in the background of a lot of different areas in DeFi. Are you getting any wind of cool new areas that are nascent and might be coming out soon? For example, just NFTs came, I think for a lot of people, came out of nowhere, and then they were this huge thing. Are you seeing anything like that as people are putting their heads down and building during this crypto winter?
Yeah, we're fortunate to see a lot of new product areas and experiments during this builder market, as we're calling it. And because Alchemy works with most chains and works with all these different verticals, it's a really privileged position in the ecosystem to see some of the most cutting edge products that are being developed. I think we're seeing a variety of kind of developments. I think one is in the enterprise space. Actually, I think this is particularly compelling. We were mentioning names earlier like Shopify. I know Starbucks is doing its large loyalty program largely based on NFTs, and they're starting to expand ways in which they're doing that around like employee learning tracks and rewards and things like that. And then I think I also saw this week Nike is expanding its swoosh marketplace and ran a huge drop. So I think there's a lot of ways that, especially given the current macroeconomic environment and kind of shift in thinking by a lot of companies to figure out ways to be closer to their communities, more running more profitable businesses, coming up with new innovative models, and especially as we're seeing things like AI only expand the amount of kind of activity happening on the internet, but also then the need for things like provenance and ownership over digital assets. I think that's a big bucket that we're seeing, and it's I think a really notable sign that a lot of these companies are not pulling back in the current market. They're just leaning into how to use this technology to really innovate and rethink their businesses and add new business models. Two is I know there's been a lot of conversation around real world assets and DeFi, and I think where things got a little bit more questionable in the last couple of years was when the benefit and the utility of a certain crypto product wasn't actually obvious and it wasn't clear, and it just relied on too many degrees of separation to really see a viable long term path. And so I think with things in DeFi actually starting to take on challenges that are more tied to points of friction, things that are expensive, things that are risky and costly in traditional finance, I think we'll see a lot more adoption and traction in that area. And then lastly, I think the third bucket is a little harder to label, but I would just say a Web3 rethink of current internet products. For example, I saw a platform the other day that is a Web3 publishing platform where they don't take the kind of extreme royalty fees that a lot of publishers do. The books that are published are captured in a decentralized fashion, such that if, let's say, the physical copies were destroyed or lost or hard to access, or a publisher decided to remove the book, these types of things can live on. And I think in general, those are some really interesting areas we're seeing during this current market. Enterprises, DeFi kind of continuing to innovate and improve upon traditional finance. And I would just say a rethink of a number of verticals from publishing to gaming to social media.
Yeah, I think the point you bring up about brands is interesting because I think there are a lot of companies that are realizing that this is a great way to get a different kind of connection with a customer. And at Decential, we're writing a lot about music and Web3. And I think it's something that some bands are also figuring out as well. And some record labels that are a little more savvy on the Web3 side of things is that this can create a really different kind of connection with an audience or with your fans. And if there's this 1,000 fan theory that if you have 1,000 passionate fans, that might be enough these days to propel a band and keep it going and keeping the lights on. And it seems like brands are definitely experimenting with that in the metaverse and stuff like that. Do you, but so are you, has any new sort of use of blockchain or peer to peer stuff caught your eye lately where you're just like, oh, wow, that's crazy. I didn't expect to see that?
Another example I saw recently, I love the music example because I do agree that it broken otherwise, right? That either you put your music up for free and just hope people listen to it, and maybe one day you'll be able to make a name for yourself if you get big enough, or you get like pennies on the dollar for streams through one of the big platforms. It's kind of, why did it have to be that way, right? Like ideally,
Yeah.
if you're creating something of value, like there should ideally be a business model, but it's been arguably too difficult to do because distribution is controlled. First it was the record labels, now it's the apps, and ultimately there's probably something better there, but it's just going to require a lot of tinkering and experiments, and eventually I think there will be new models that get figured out that are hopefully better for artists, without even compromising and maybe improving the fan experience. Another area that I saw was interesting recently, I saw a company that's starting to put there. You'll have to forgive me, I'm forgetting the names, but there are a few different projects. One where in certain emerging markets, they're starting to put police records on chain. It's
Yeah.
something that I take for granted in the US and a lot of more rural areas and emerging markets where there can be more corruption sometimes in law enforcement, people would report crimes and then just have the records completely destroyed before because maybe the police officer is a friend of the person who's on the other side of an allegation. Like those are public records that should be probably saved and recorded. I also saw somebody putting carbon credits on chain as a way to just instill trust in kind of all the counterparties around kind of whether or not this was an authentic transaction and having something that is verifiable easily without some sort of, again, a middleman needing to provide that authentication. So I think just in general, this concept of really fundamental use of blockchain around immutable record keeping and
Hmm.
but now deploying it to specific scenarios where it's useful, I think is something that seems so obvious that it should have happened before, but I think there was a disconnect between probably the technology primitive of a record and the actual visceral consumer use case.
Are they using Ethereum for those? Do you know?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I like the public records angle. Hadn't heard that before. Talking about music being broken, it's just been amazing to me because I've never really covered that very much before, but we're like more in the culture side of things at Decential. I'm learning things like when a band goes on tour and they sell out stadiums all across the country, they don't get any information about those fans or who they are or like who's buying their tickets to their own shows. That's controlled by Live Nation and other middlemen. So that's like a huge data set that bands and musicians aren't allowed to access because then they could go directly to their fans and start a relationship that way. And that's just one example. There's many others in the music world that are just, it just seems like it's just so corrupt and needs to be definitely disintermediated in a lot of different ways. I was wondering how you feel about all the damage that was sort of done last year in 2022 in lots of different areas of crypto. A lot of centralized entities in the space failed, whether it was crypto credit companies or the biggest one obviously being FTX. Do you think that damage has been limited, or do you think that's going to have longer lasting effects on the public in general and whether they want to come back around to crypto when things get hot again?
Yeah, I definitely think that what happened last year was, I think, a huge setback for Web3 in the crypto industry and completely unnecessary in a sense, right? It was a set of, generally speaking, bad actors that took advantage of people and good faith, and that will work its kind of way through society, if you will, and the set of consequences there. And so, unfortunately, I do think that has a lasting effect, and it makes things harder for people that are building genuinely useful products who have genuinely good intentions. And it makes new technologies are already quite difficult to gain trust and adoption in the mainstream consciousness, and without having this sort of malfeasance on alleged activities that have happened last year. So I do think it's unfortunate. At the same time, I think that myself and us here at Alchemy are definitely believers in Web3, optimists. We're seeing actually growing developer adoption, growing consumer adoption, even though that's counter to most of the narratives around token prices or surveys done around consumer trust in crypto. And so I think in the medium and long term, because the technology itself is fundamentally useful and because people are building real products, that trust will be built and rebuilt. And I think that we will get to a place where Web3 is commonly used by everyday consumers around the world. And again, it's very similar, I think, to early days of the internet where somebody stole my credit card number online or there's identity theft done online. And I think there were a lot of kind of scams, and there still are. But eventually, the value of the platform was so great that, and then the mitigation techniques grew stronger and stronger that it was able to still flourish as a technology. So I'm optimistic that we'll see something similar with Web3, where the bad actors will be rooted out. And over time, we'll see so much value created by the industry that people are able to be safe and benefit from the upside and the positive impact of the technology.
Yeah. It seems like one of the risks, though, at least short term, is the regulatory environment. I know you're head of growth at Alchemy. Not you're not head of government relations, but are you getting any wind of what the mood is like and the vibe is like in DC right now among not just like within Congress, but within the agencies like the SEC and others that have some regulatory oversight here?
I don't really have any insight into it personally. I'm just hoping that governments around the world can generally see the opportunity that the technology provides while still finding a sensible way to keep consumers safe and protected as they benefit from it. But no, unfortunately, I don't have any particular insight or comment around the regulatory environment.
Yeah. It does seem it's not letting up very, I don't know, but yeah, it seems a little more serious than I've seen in other past instances in my career when regulators get involved. I think it's got a really bad reputation within, I think, the White House and some other places, like at the SEC with Gary Gensler, which is unfortunate. One thing, so we've talked about how important you guys are at Alchemy and instrumental in all different ways. And that sort of, in a strange way, has led to some criticism of you guys and other companies like Infura that have this very large market share of what they're doing in the back end for Web3 and blockchain. Do you worry that you guys are too centralized in a ecosystem that's not supposed to rely on a central point of failure? Or how do you guys like think about that at Alchemy? And just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think there's a couple ways to think about it. I think one is that ultimately Web3 still does depend on having a few key drivers, I think, to move it forward. For example, Ethereum, right? Ethereum as an ecosystem has most of the market share, right? In terms of attention,
Hmm.
developers, capital that's flowing through it. But then you also have the L2s and you have now an effect of Ethereum being around for so long that people do in fact trust it. But ultimately, you could argue, oh, wow, all the activity is somewhat centralized in Web3 around this, ironically, decentralized protocol. But it's something to think about, right? And I think when we look at DEXs and AMMs and things like that, like a lot of volume will, let's say, go through Uniswap, right? But the protocol is decentralized, doesn't, even though it's a small team, like it can feel centralized, but it's actually not. And similarly with Alchemy, for us, we don't have an industry if it's not sufficiently easy for people to build products ultimately. And in addition to that, Alchemy, we don't actually hold your data, store your data, let's say like a Web2 hosting provider. We're just basically a gateway and access point, right? And if you wanted to tomorrow use a different access point, one might be able to do that. And so for us, we think it's really important to just focus when the company was started, it was pretty clear what people wanted from Alchemy. They're like, look, we just can't build anything because the nodes keep going down. And that was just an existential sort of problem for the whole space. So I think Alchemy has just tried to stay laser focused on kind of meeting the needs of dApps and developers and enable that consumer adoption. And ultimately, developers have choice between what chains they want to use, dApps they want to build, whether they would want to run their own nodes ultimately. So we just are really focused on providing value, making sure it's easy to build in the space. And ultimately, we feel like it's probably healthy for the space to have multiple players across all these different verticals.
Yeah. And I know some of the more recent VC funds that you've raised at Alchemy were to help you grow in different geographies around the world and just try to scale because you guys are getting, so there's so much demand for what you guys are doing. How's that going?
We're lucky to have the backing of some of the world's best investors and continue to grow and scale. And fortunately, we've been able to launch support for a lot of new chains. For example, we launched support recently for StarkNet. We're building a lot of new functionality for developers that we're announcing. We announced a new data streaming product around what's called custom webhooks to make that easier for developers.
Did you guys go on to Flow? You were going to go on to Flow, I think is where NBA Top Shop is that?
Oh, we have worked with Flow in the past. Most recently, we launched StarkNet as the kind of newest chin, and we're always looking at where developers going, where can we help move the ecosystem, and what role can we play to make it easier for developers to build on new chains. We also launched Polygon ZK VM support recently back in March. So we're always expanding new chains, trying to make it easier for multi-chain products to exist or for developers to use whatever chain is most impactful for the type of product that they're building. So absolutely, the chains that we support, the new developer suites that we're launching, in addition to custom webhooks, we announced account extraction infrastructure, which we think takes an otherwise challenging concept for any one developer to understand or implement a product around and make that really easy so that things like two-factor authentication, account recovery, gasless transactions, all of these things all of a sudden can become possible and really help move the space forward in terms of that being the standard for how products are built. Fortunately, we're lucky. We've maintained, I think, a lot of momentum and kind of positive energy and velocity of shipping products through the ups and the downs in crypto over the last few years. And we're hoping to just continue to see that steady growth of adoption on the consumer and the developer side continue.
Yeah. And it does seem like everything is, and this isn't necessarily surprising, but is going to be the reality of several different chains that do different things. Like Solana is very fast. Ethereum has the most interest in developers working on it. And are you seeing that as well? I know you guys like to say you're blockchain agnostic at Alchemy. Is that the way that this is all panning out, that there are going to be special certain chains for certain transaction types or different activity? Is that how you think things are going to keep going?
It's certainly possible, as well as I do. It's unfortunately incredibly difficult to actually predict anything in
Yeah.
crypto or Web3 accurately. But certainly, yes, what we've seen is developers use different chains, sometimes for different purposes. Sometimes it's a technology reason, sometimes it's a cultural reason. The NFT ecosystem of a certain chain might be really compelling, and the foundation that's working in support of that chain may have created kind of conditions and environment that are really attractive for folks to work there. Yeah, we see a mix, whether it's across, again, like gaming or DeFi. With DeFi, it's what does the liquidity on the chain look like, or how, to your point on speed, or transactions very fast, such that either traders or other economic participants can kind of have faith that the transaction will go through and do so in a fast amount of time. Certainly seeing the kind of continuation of folks experimenting on different chains. And we've also heard increasing adoption and exploration of what if a individual app would need its own chain to be able to,
Mhm.
that might settle to an L2 and the L1 ultimately. And that's a possible theme and trend that we may see as well. So a lot of ongoing developments, I would say, there, and we'll be really interested to see how this plays out in the next couple of years.
Yeah. I will make one prediction. I know you said that you shouldn't, but I will. And I think it's this, that I don't think there'll ever be an Ethereum killer. I know people love to tag new blockchains as Ethereum killers, but I just don't see that happening. And I admit I'm a bit biased, having written the book on Ethereum, but I think it's a great chain. And I think people, there's too much in crypto. There's too much like zero sum game kind of thinking, I think, where it's like, it has to be all or nothing. And I don't think that's what any of this is about. I think all of this is about alternatives. And that means you can build an alternative to Ethereum, like Solana or Avalanche or whatever you want to do, and get different features that you're looking for. But I do think it will be very interesting to see how all of this, yeah, exactly, this ecosystem takes place. And we're seeing, I think, better technology with bridges and things like that, so that it's not necessarily like a bunch of pillars, but they're more connected and interlinked, I think would be interesting. Jason, this has been great. I really appreciate all your insight and taking the time to talk with me today. Why don't you tell folks how they can find out more about Alchemy if they would like to?
Yeah, sure. To learn more about Alchemy, feel free to just go to alchemy.com. We're also on Twitter at just /alchemy platform. And feel free to join our Discord. We have a lot of conversation among thousands of developers there and are happy to help you build whatever you're building in Web3.
Yeah. All right. That's great. Please say hi to Joe and Nikhil for me. And again, thanks a lot for coming on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks so much, Matt. I really enjoyed our conversation as well.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to rate and follow this show on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Decent People is a production of Decential Media. It is produced by Matt Bogart, with music by Brian Duncan and Kareem Imes.